treat your podcast as a sales asset, not just a hobby.
It needs to have intention and strategy behind it. You shouldn't be making random podcast episodes that you just thought like, oh, this will be a good idea.
The unique thing about Alex was that he never partnered with anybody, which leads us into talking about Diary of a CEO, who actually does quite heavily leverage sponsors as a part of his videos. However,
another pro tip, if you want to make sure you maximize the ROI from your podcast episodes, is welcome legends to Podcast Marketing Secrets,
where we share all of the tactics and strategies from the #1 podcasting agency
on how to launch, grow, manage, and monetize a successful high converting podcast.
Let's take your business and content to the next level.
In today's episode, we are uncovering how top industry leaders like Alex Hormozi and Diary of a CEO are leveraging their podcast for maximum ROI. Cal, would you like to get us started?
Absolutely. But first, we probably need to do just a little bit of a disclaimer here. These guys are at the top of their game when it comes to podcasting. And so as we've mentioned in previous episodes, some of the typical rules that we might suggest for somebody just beginning their podcasting journey don't necessarily apply to these guys. However, there are a few things that are really good to note and point out through the strategies that they've applied for their podcast. So we're going to dive a little bit into that, and then we're going to wrap things up by letting you know the other elements of how you should be leveraging your podcast for the stage in the journey where you're at. So if we get started with Alex Hormozi, the game is his podcast. Chris Williamson actually said to us that the best way to leverage your podcast is by having a back-end business and then building a podcast as your content machine, not necessarily making a business out of podcasting. And that's exactly what Alex Hormozi did. He spent years prior to even getting into the content game actually building his business, building his knowledge in order to then start his podcast, his whole content creation, and provide value. Now, everything that he does with his content is geared specifically towards entrepreneurs, his target audience that he ultimately wants to target and can then service through his back-end offers like acquisition.com.
Absolutely. And his entire strategy, if you look at it, and he has broken this down in the past because he is doing exactly what we do for our podcast partners, which is tracking all the data. So he has tested so many things to know what exactly works and ultimately what not only gets attention, but brings him customers, because all he cares about is scaling acquisition.com, his backend business. That's the reason why he's doing all of this, okay? So the first thing is that he initially was focused on doing a lot of entertainment and education content in a mix, what some people will call edutainment. And he got a lot of views. He did some videos that were not necessarily business related. Some of them were relationship related, things with Layla Hormozi, as well as
health,
gyms,
cooking.
Health, exactly. So some of the topics that he was covering were getting a ton of views, but wasn't really directly connected to the customer that he's hoping to get out of the attention. And then essentially, after testing for many months, they realized it was pretty clear that, yes, they were getting a ton of views and they were growing a lot, but they weren't seeing as many conversions compared to making content that was purely about business and scaling businesses, which is exactly what they help business owners do. They literally help them scale to millions of dollars, okay? And then they're looking to acquire some of those best performing businesses.
That's such a great point, data-driven decisions. And we've actually spoken about this on a previous episode. It also, through doing content in this way, revealed a new opportunity for him, which is that not everybody that he will eventually service is at the level yet to work with him. And so naturally, as you continue on this content creation podcasting journey, you might uncover other opportunities as you go. And so he's also identified now that his content has to appeal to slightly more advanced versions of his avatar, as well as those that are at the beginning. So if I was to highlight as well, what he does as a part of his show notes is he's actually giving away free resources. So for instance, in a recent YouTube video, he has a scaling roadmap in there. So he's giving away resources to further assist the avatar that he's speaking to in those videos.
These, by the way, they are all lead magnets. All he's trying to do with some of those assets is to collect the information of the leads, but ultimately he's just looking to provide more value up front to then eventually one day hopefully do business with that potential customer. And as well, if you look at his journey when it comes to business, eventually what happened is, as a result of all his content, he got into the position of doing business with the founder of School, which, if you are not living under a rock, is one of the fastest education and online courses platforms. So what he did was take a stake on the business with School, and then that solved another problem that he had, which is a lot of potential viewers or of segment of his audience will never be able to work directly with acquisition.com. But this now gave him an entry-level offer where he can help almost anyone, because in order to get into a platform like School, all you need to do is pay $99 a month, right? So it kind of gave him one of his dream clients, a company that he could take a stake on or acquire, and then also allow him to then serve the lower end of his market.
And that actually perfectly leads into sponsorships and affiliations with your podcast. The unique thing about Alex was that he never partnered with anybody. He never engaged in sponsorship deals with anybody until it felt truly aligned with what would be valuable to his target audience there as well. It also made it incredibly unique when he brought this in, and people trusted him by that point, because previous to that, he had never engaged in sponsorship. So when he actually did it, people took it very seriously, which leads us into talking about Diary of a CEO, who actually does quite heavily leverage sponsors as a part of his videos. However, as just mentioned, they're perfectly aligned. So for instance, you won't see him making a podcast episode around health, and then the sponsor for that will be something related to, example?
Travel.
To travel, for instance. It's perfectly aligned. So for instance, he did an episode topic around healthcare, and therefore the mid-roll ad, the ad at the center of the video, was related to this specific type of shoe that's going to improve your overall mobility and therefore health.
And something that we have chatted as well in the past, and hence why we even had that disclaimer at the beginning of the episode, 99% of business owners out there will not really truly get a huge ROI from bringing a sponsor, especially if your podcast and your show is completely new to the game. Before you even think of bringing a sponsor, you need to have some level of track record and proof that you are truly an authority figure in your particular industry that will also have some sort of audience that a potential sponsorship wants to tap into. So it's not really the best way to monetize a podcast. It is probably the second best way, I would say, in terms of sponsorships. Looking for high ticket sponsors is going to be the best way if you don't have an existing backend business and what we call a knockout offer, which will always be the fastest way for you to make a great ROI on your content and podcast, but also having a sustainability behind essentially the content engine that you're building.
Absolutely. Okay, now we've talked about the big dogs. Maybe let's bring it back a step and let's highlight some other great points of leverage that you should be using for your particular podcast. So the first one would be treat it as a sales asset, not just content for entertainment.
This is extremely crucial. I would love for you to understand that every single podcast episode that you make is a mini VSL and sales and trust asset. So it needs to have intention and strategy behind it. You shouldn't be making random podcast episodes that you just thought like, oh, this will be a good idea. There should be intention behind it. And how is this assisting or aiding your backend sales process? Imagine if every time your sales team, or even yourself, if you're the one leading the sales for your business, have a stack of content that is all free to consume and it is in full relationship with the problems and desires that your dream customer has, and leading to a sales call. You can maximize those assets so that they show up to your calls warmed and pre-sold on what you do, and it's more about literally how do we get started.
Yeah, including it in your nurture sequences, whether it's linking them on an SMS or an email, whatever it may be, as you just mentioned, it's going to make a world of difference to your sales. Another useful way to leverage your podcast is through creating testimonial-based content. How you would do this is strategically inviting other customers that you might have serviced in the past and getting their raw and real take on either what it was like to work with you or some other angle that you can actually choose for that podcasting conversation. We know that testimonial-based content is incredibly important for making any additional sales. So actually using your podcast as a resource to have those conversations will allow you to increase that know, like, and trust with your audience.
Another pro tip, if you want to make sure you maximize the ROI from your podcast episodes, is make specific links to your funnel that are basically segmented on each one of those episodes, or use a tracking platform like Harros that will allow you to determine which is the particular podcast episode that is bringing the biggest ROI. And don't ever just think that because an episode has the most amount of views is the episode that is driving the most amount of revenue. You will be absolutely stunned at how many times we have looked at an episode that doesn't have that many views or that much traction, but ultimately we look at the customer list and most of the people that ended up buying the offer in the backend came from that particular episode, just because it spoke deeper to the dream customer, or it provide them enough information for them to take the next logical steps in the sales process.
And one final thing on your sales team as well is training them to ask the questions. Sometimes a lot of the attribution for your podcasting content will come back to anecdotal feedback, asking questions, engaging in conversations. So it's very important to let your sales team know when they're having these conversations to dive a little bit deeper. If someone says they saw you on social media, what post might it have been? Was it your podcasting content as well? So those are just a few ways that you can leverage your podcast, not only modeling what some of the top podcasters are doing in the industry, but also just bringing it back to maybe more so the level that each of you listeners might be at the moment. But if you are looking to better leverage your podcast, it's probably worthwhile having a conversation with us. So the best way for you to do that is to book a viral podcast system demo. We'll leave the link for you down in the show notes, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for joining us on Podcast Marketing Secrets. If you found value in this episode, the best way you can support us in continuing to deliver this content to you is by giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. Now, if you're keen to connect with us, we are at Vibez Creative on all your other social media platforms. Please send us your questions, engage with us, let us know what you want to hear about next on the podcast, and we'll be sure to create content around that.
And if you're interested in partnering with us for the highest level of support for you to be able to launch, grow, manage, and monetize a successful podcast for your business or your personal brand, we offer different levels of support, starting from our services, one-on-one coaching, as well as our completely done-for-you system. So if you're interested in finding out more, book a call with our team down in the description below.